Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and a few weeks ago, in November 2024, I was interviewed by Jay Martin, and he kindly agreed that I could post this also on my channel. So here is the interview with me by Jay Martin in the Neutrality Studies format. Please enjoy.
All right, here I am with Pascal Lotta. Pascal, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for making the time today.
Thank you very much for having me, Jay.
So I thoroughly enjoy your podcast and your content, and I'm excited to ask you a bunch of questions today. Here's where I want to start. When you look at the plethora of global conflicts, you see, hot wars in Europe, in the Middle East, rising tensions in the South Pacific, a series of coups on the continent of Africa. Do you tend to look at all of these conflicts as isolated, maybe territorial disputes, events, or is there a larger trend and something coordinated occurring that is inspiring all these to erupt so frequently? What's your take?
Well, my take is that a lot of these conflicts are in a sense normal, as that we've always had them. I mean, we've never had a moment in history when we had no conflicts on the planet, right? And the question always is, how hot do they boil? Like how intensely are they fought? And what are the root causes for them? And a lot of the roots are actually local. You can trace the Russo-Ukrainian war back to local roots with inside Ukraine, with these different language groups and the political upheaval that happened even before 2014, with the tensions between these different groups. And you can do the same, of course, with the Israel-Palestine conflict. I mean, with what we're currently seeing is the outcome, is the genocide that is the end point, or the continuation of a 75-year-old policy that, however, can be traced, of course, to local groups on the ground, whether or not they were imported from abroad. But once you have people on the ground, then these conflicts starts. Same with the coups and so on in several African states. There is always a very strong local component. However, that is also made worse by international influence. In Ukraine, Russia, you could have clearly de-escalated these local conflicts at several points in time over the last 10, 15 years, had it not been for foreign influence, and that includes the US, Europe, and Russia. There would have been a way to force the Oslo Accords on Israel had some promises been kept, and not like constant support also from the US being given to Israel to basically do what it wants. And especially now, the conflict could be de-escalated quickly by cutting off the weapon flows. So the foreign component is a very important one, and one that I wouldn't be able to say like which one is more important: the domestic issues that trigger them, or the international environment that fuels these conflicts. But it's an interplay of both usually, and we've seen that for a long, long time. I mean, let's take Chile and Allende. The overthrow of him wouldn't have been possible without CIA support, right? But at the same time, you always had these groups internally that were that wanted political change. You can go back to the Spanish Civil War, and you can showcase how Francisco Franco wouldn't have won had it not been for interventions from the Germans and the Italians to a certain part, and certain policies by the US and others. So in a sense, this is a normal thing. Now, for the current environment, something that fuels both of these conflicts is I think the changing international system from a unipolar hegemonic one that we are coming out of into a multipolar one that we are going into. And I think we can talk more about that. But, it's an interplay of both. And sadly, I think of this as a relatively normal thing, at least not something that we are seeing for the first time.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. So in a sense, that the tensions are not new. The roots of the tensions are local, and it's all about how hot do these tensions boil. And right now, a lot of them seem to be boiling over the top. And that's related to the foreign actors who are essentially the accelerant to the fire. And they can extend these conflicts, they can amplify these conflicts. And maybe right now, because of the fragile nature of the world order, nations are seeing an opportunity, right, to make a move on the chessboard because there's some fracture lines in the strength of the global power. We're transitioning from unipolar to multipolar. Did I summarize that sufficiently, Pascal?
I think so. I'm just not entirely sure how conscious these moves are,
Okay.
because in my view, there's a very high likelihood that a lot of what we are seeing is actually the outcome of decisions made by actors who feel compelled to do something in response to something else. And then you have this action reaction mechanism going on, in the sense that, once the full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine happened, that on the one hand, yes, I think NATO saw an opportunity to fight a war, and we know that these approaches are trying to find a way, an off-ramp back in April 2022 was proactively stifled basically by, well, the people around Boris Johnson and the people around him and the supporters of, like, let's fight it out. So that was an active decision, but that decision was informed by the idea that, okay, Russia will probably lose if we just throw everything in. So in a sense, it's like NATO acting on a certain belief of that the forces on the ground are in its favor. So it makes sense for them to try to go all out. And then Russia, on the other hand, was then forced to fight an actual war of attrition, which, as far as I can tell, was not the original intent. And then you have one thing leading to another, and have a 2.5 year protracted, soon 3 year protracted, horrible war of attrition. And at the same time, then this leads to something like the BRICS movement getting accelerated because of the sanctions that were put on Russia, and Russia then having to do something, and actors like China but also Brazil and South Africa then actually trying to work more closely together, because the conflict itself upends certain ways in which the international community could interact. So it's a part opportunism, but part also just a natural reaction to what is going on, in a sense that not everything is planned, not everything is like strategized about, but a lot of things are also just informed by what happened previously.
Right. So to say that because we're transitioning from unipolar to multipolar, and therefore there's a lot of conscious moves being made, maybe overthinking it. There's probably a bit of just sort of chaos theory at play here. Things are happening and actors are responding to those. Okay, I'm with you there. You mentioned the rise of the BRICS, and so I just want to pull on that for a minute because we just got through the BRICS summit. I've seen a very wide variety of coverage come out of that summit on both sides of the argument, meaning some coverage has come out and said, really nothing was resolved or confirmed at this meeting. There's a lot of noise over the last year and a half about Saudi Arabia. They didn't even show up. Good conversations, but essentially nothing concrete came out of this. And I've heard the opposite as well, that we're moving further down the path of financial rails that can facilitate global trade outside of US dollar and SWIFT. And they both seem to be true. If you kind of dig into it, you're like, yeah, I mean, things don't move as quickly as hyperbolic journalists maybe want them to, and simultaneously things are still moving forward. So what's your take on the significance of the BRICS summit? And I'd love to ask you this, just on the BRICS movement in general. How does this organization and union play a role in the global order moving forward?
Well, at the moment, BRICS plays a role in the sense that it created an excitement, I would say, in the global south about alternative ways of of interacting and having a new forum, right, in which you can exchange and something to build up. It's something that can actively be shaped, because the traditional avenues are now either blocked or they're kind of cemented in a place where you cannot tear them down. You don't want to tear them down, but at the same time, these institutions are not useful anymore. And they have a certain usefulness, but they don't go beyond that. Let's take the United Nations. We know the UN is basically unreformable because of the veto of the five permanent members of the Security Council, and because of its structure. But at the same time, nobody wants to tear it down because it still serves a purpose. But that purpose is well defined and cannot be extended much other than a certain nuances left and right. Take the G20, which is a useful forum for states to meet, and they do that voluntarily, but there's no structures then coming out of that. There's no institutions to be built with it. BRICS is at the moment a movement that offers the possibility to create new institutions like a development bank, like a new currency exchange system, a clearing system, and so on. And that is a creative process, and it offers that precisely because it is not a clearly and strongly defined institution in and of itself yet. So I look at the BRICS as the current version of what in the Cold War we had as the non-aligned movement, which was kind of a conglomeration of states that didn't want to be part of the either or that the bipolar system of the Cold War had created. Now, the problem BRICS has, and the problem that NUM had, is that at some point, if you're successful of attracting a lot of attention from third states, there's going to be a need to become something, right? And then you have different visions of what that something should be, and managing these internal then conflicts, which are not violent conflicts but ideological and conflicts of vision. That is difficult, and you can see, in my view, right now how BRICS is trying to very delicately navigate those waters, because, for instance, in the last meeting in South Africa, BRICS enlarged its core membership group. And as you said, like, some actually then ended up not joining, like Saudi Arabia. We don't know. I mean, Saudi Arabia kind of officially is there, but didn't send a head of state. I think the foreign minister was actually in Kazan, but I might be wrong about that. But Argentina didn't, in the end, had a change of government and didn't join. But others did, and there was a joining of the core group. And the important thing here is that the core group gets full rights, just like the original five, on voting, and BRICS works on consensus. Now, if you have a group that gets larger and larger that needs to reach a consensus, it gets harder and harder to reach that, because every single member can then put the brakes on whatever the others might want to realize. So, and this is only getting more complicated. So what we've seen now in Kazan is that BRICS actually created a new membership category of, I think they're called partners, BRICS partners. Right. And it is not clear to me what these partners can and can't do, and how important their influence is in like deciding what happens. But because BRICS is still relatively informal, this is a sweet way of enlarging the group and keeping countries to aspire to join BRICS, while also still maintaining some flexibility to go forward. But this is going to get harder, and I'm pretty sure the people in charge of the planning of the group are aware of that. Not just the leaders of the states, but also the diplomats, the Sherpas, the top diplomats who actually interact with each other on an administrative level, that they need to find a way to deal with this. Because in the end, this question of institutionalization is one that I think more or less broke the neck of NUM, the non-aligned movement, over time, because I just recently learned from Malta's foreign minister at the time that it was Tito's opposition to formalization, to institutionalization, that the non-aligned movement never created a secretariat and permanent structure. because Tito in Yugoslavia said, if we do that, the Soviets might undermine it and will bring in their people and pay people, and then we're gonna lose it.
Interesting.
That is quite interesting, isn't it? And thoughts like these must go through the minds of the people who are currently building BRICS. And I'm pretty sure there's differences of vision, even though at the Kazan meeting they managed to pass a very long outcome document, 139 or so articles, almost 140, very long, very complex, and all in the language of we aspire, we want, we agree. It's difficult to get that agreement by everybody, but they managed to do so. Now, how this goes forward is of course the big question, but I do believe that in terms of a creative environment to shape international relations, BRICS is actually the most important initiative to change something.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And when you speak about the differences in vision, even in the absolute core, the BRIC nations, right? You have countries like Russia and China who it seems to me, want a much harder break from Western relationships than maybe India and Brazil, who probably want to maintain and slightly reform their relationships. And I wondered about the partner program because I saw that as well. There's now BRICS members and then BRICS partners as a subcategory. And immediately I thought, is this an option now for the fence sitters? Countries who have expressed interest like Saudi Arabia, but they seem to be playing both sides because why wouldn't you if you could? And the nations either looking at or involved in the partnership program are substantial countries. If I have them, it's like Thailand and Indonesia, like major economies. And could that be part of the incentive to offer a partnership program that is not like full patch membership, but it's something close? However, it allows you to maybe tell the rest of the world, we're not a BRICS member, we're just a partner, right? Could there be some substance to that?
Yes, I think this is probably one of the thoughts that's behind this partner program. I'm not entirely sure yet what it entails because I haven't read any of the rules. I don't think they're out, like what that clearly outlines what the partner program is. Sure. But it looks to me a little bit like observer status in other international organizations. The thing is that whatever jargon you use, observer, partner, whatever, at the end of the day, it depends on what the definitions of those things are, right? And those definitions might exist, they might not, right? So in order to if you create something, keeping things vague is in your interest. Only once you figure out how to do a certain thing correctly, you want to make it more concrete in order to institutionalize over time and then make it possible to hand over to the next generations and so on. But at the beginning, you want to keep it vague. And I think it is vague at the moment. And in this sense, I guess BRICS is also experimenting now with how this will work out, because we've seen like different countries applying for full membership and for partnership status, especially like smaller ones applying for full membership and larger ones for partnership, which is interesting. So I can't really tell you yet what that means, but it is probably a way just to keep also the momentum going. Because I don't see BRICS necessarily as wanting to be a counterpole to the West, more as an alternative, because they went out of their way in the final statement also to say that they are not created in opposition to anyone. They just want to fix what is fixable amongst themselves, or create alternative structures, but not against. I look at it more as leaving the West behind and doing their own thing, but not trying to define themselves in antagonism. It's not a NATO, right? NATO essentially needs Russia, and it needs an enemy. That's how it makes sure it remains relevant. The greatest crisis of NATO was the end of the Cold War, when suddenly all the enemies went away, and in the 2000s, you had the war against terror, but NATO wasn't big on that one. NATO was there, but there was this serious question, like what to do with this thing? Should it go away because the Warsaw Pact dissolved? I mean, what is the legitimacy for NATO? And now with the war against Russia, it has refound that purpose. And you can tell in the statements of these people how glad they are that they can fight against something. BRICS doesn't do that. BRICS doesn't define itself in opposition. It is a movement to do something else and to offer more possibilities to interact. And of course, some of these initiatives are geared against institutions like the IMF or the World Bank in the sense that they would want to be used more than those institutions. The Bretton Woods idea of how the international economy is structured, but it's not necessarily in opposition. It's more like in addition. And in that sense, I think the partnership program is, I mean, certainly it will help countries to tell them that, look, you don't need to choose, but it's also just a way to integrate more loosely and like try out a little bit what happens, and then you go forward.
Mm-hmm. So that would explain, I think I saw some language on the back end of the summit, BRICS coverage effectively referring to themselves as not anti-Western, but non-Western, and making that differentiation, correct?
Yeah, I interpret it that way as well, because BRICS doesn't need an opposite. It's its own thing, and you can tell because they are not trying to copy the structures from the West. They're actually trying to come up with new ideas of how to improve trade, how to have new forums of discussions when it comes to security and, fight against terrorism and so on. But they're not trying to copy paste. I mean, a little bit. A couple of these, like the BRICS Bank and so on, of course, takes inspiration from maybe the IMF and the World Bank, but it's not. It's not everything in BRICS is built in opposition. It's not like a Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was built as the Soviet version of NATO, right? That's not what BRICS is.
Yeah. I mean, everything that as I've followed the development of BRICS for the last few years, everything has pointed to, an alternative to the SWIFT banking system. And that's what, Project Mbridge, the BRICS Clear program, and now there's a similar, effectively like a credit card system, I believe, for average travelers to travel within BRICS countries and transact in a soon-to-be BRICS currency. But Pascal, is there any military agreements among the BRICS nations to come to one another's defense in the event of a conflict or an invasion, or any parallel agreements on that front?
No, not as far as I know. I mean, unless there's some secret agreements that are so secret that we actually haven't heard about them. Because there are secret agreements which people talk about, which is stupid. But anyhow, unless there's something like that, I wouldn't have heard of it. And like if there is a security pact that you haven't heard of, it's a pretty stupid security pact, because the idea of security pacts is to scare the others away, right? So I don't think that there is a security component that goes beyond what is in the outcome document, and the outcome document outlines cooperation, especially in the fields of terrorism and cybersecurity and so on. But those are pretty general talking points, which any Western state would also sign up to, in the sense that that's also what they want, right? It's just they don't want it within the BRICS framework. They want it for themselves. But it's definitely not a mutual security clause like Article 5 of the NATO treaty. No. The only new such treaties that I have seen in recently are a security agreement between Russia and North Korea, which the North Koreans published on their state broadcaster in a quoted version. So I'm not entirely sure if that is an accurate one, but since the North Koreans published it, let's just suppose if that's the real one, then that one includes a hard security clause, but that's between Russia and North Korea. And North Korea is, to my knowledge, didn't even apply for partner status.
Right.
I think not.
And actually on that development, then I want to switch directions a little bit, but seems to be relatively clear cut. North Korea is sending troops to be trained in Russia and shuttled to the front lines to support the war effort. Is that a decent understanding of what's occurred thus far?
I don't know. This is one of these weird stories that at the beginning looked like a bad joke
Okay.
from the Western side. And now the talk is expanding, and Russia hasn't actually denied it, although I believe North Korea has said this
Okay.
is not what's happening. But I am not sure. I simply, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the Russians don't deny it, to me, seems to point the toward this actually, yeah, maybe happening, that there are now North Korean troops training in Russia.
Yeah, it was funny how
I can't tell. I haven't seen any pictures or any kind of any proof that would actually beyond reasonable doubt show that. But that might be me having missed the proof.
right. Well, I mean, Putin was asked about this, and yeah, his response was not to deny, but it was very sort of vague and misleading. And I'm paraphrasing probably terribly, but effectively he said, "Oh, if there's North Korean troops in Russia, and they're headed to the front lines, like, yeah, that would make sense." He didn't even. Yeah, it was interesting. Almost, he was almost encouraging the reader or the journalist to make that assumption, which was interesting. Okay, I want to switch directions up to the South Pacific. One of the main topics of conversation on my show is the tension between China and Taiwan, or the Republic of China. And I hear a variety of opinions. You're based in Japan. You're a lot closer to this than we are out here in Canada. But first of all, what's your take, Pascal? What would you assume might be the near-term events between China, Taiwan, and the United States over the next couple of years?
I mean, as an optimist, I hope that this current status quo, which has been very beneficial for both Taipei and Beijing, will be maintained. And it has been beneficial for the United States and Japan as well, in the sense that it keeps the region calm. We have now the conflict between Beijing and Taipei is a unresolved Second World War conflict, more or less very similar to North and South Korea. They were basically the outcome of the way the Second World War ended, although in the case of China and Taiwan, it of course has to do with the events immediately after 45 and the Civil War that happened, right? And Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists withdrawing their troops to Taiwan, and then installing their Republic of China on the island, and for the longest time claiming to represent the entirety of China, while the actual power then, of course, lay with the People's Republic of China, founded in 1949 by Mao Zedong, and the communists who were ruling over mainland China. And that civil war has never ended, although the weapons went silent. So similar to how North and South Korea are currently not shooting against each other, but have never had a formal peace agreement. Also, Taiwan and also Taipei and Beijing never had a formal like written down agreement of how to continue. Although I must say the relationship between Beijing and Taipei is economically, socially, and just people to people much more beneficial than North and South Korea, right? Taipei and Beijing managed to find a way to not have a peace agreement, to not officially accept each other, but to live with each other. And to the point where, a person born in Taiwan can fly to mainland China, a person born in mainland China can fly to Taiwan, they can visit each other, they talk, they exchange. You have mechanisms. Mainland China is the largest trading partner of the island of Taiwan, right? So this is a very, very different setup from North and South Korea, and way more beneficial. So as an optimist, I would hope that this continues and that we can kick the can down the road, and in the hope that at some point a new way of convergence will emerge. Because, these conflicts, when they last for a long time, have the propensity to change their nature. And at some point, I would hope that a change occurs that allows these two to, find an agreement amongst themselves, and actually create a written down final point to the conflict. This is something that happened, in Europe in 1989 with Germany. The two Germanys, in the end, the way that the whole thing was resolved is that you had the 4+2 talks. So you had the four victors of the Second World War and the two Germanys who sat down and created an agreement, drafted it, signed it, and Germany was reunited, or West Germany overtook East Germany, but you had a common framework, and that conflict is now resolved. I mean, it's just over. We are not talking about it anymore because it's not there anymore. Yes, Germany still has internal problems and disagreements between former East and former West, but those are internal matters. Internationally, the conflict is done. Now, I would hope that at some point we get to that situation also in the Pacific. But until we do, the most important thing is to keep a modus vivendi alive and going. And the danger is, of course, that some outside force might make matters worse. Because again, there's different visions of how this conflict should end, and I hope it doesn't end in violence.
Well, you know what? Yeah, I'm sure there's many different visions about how it should end. I know in the West specifically, or I should say North America, where I live, there's also a gross misunderstanding of how it began. And most people aren't aware that there's an unresolved civil war. And that's how you have Taiwan and the People's Republic of China as two separate, relatively sovereign states. Can I ask you, why has the United States become so involved in the island of Taiwan? I know the policy's been strategic ambiguity and all of this, but there's a lot of rhetoric at times from various podiums in the United States that they would run to the rescue if China were to make some sort of a hostile or non-hostile, maybe legal takeover for Taiwan. Is there a case for that, similar to Hong Kong, Pascal, where China has a legal case to be made to reclaim the island? And what's your take on that? I've heard that from a guest that I believe I found on your show, Warwick Powell. But what's your take?
I mean, Warwick and I agree on most issues. The one that we, I think, disagree a bit is on what the right framing is in order to understand the conflict. I think Warwick's strongest argument is that this is an internal matter, right? Taiwan is part of China, and this is an internal dispute among a province and the center. I will discuss this with him again if I misunderstand him. But I view this as, again, the outcome of this unresolved civil war, and the historical trajectory that this took with all the different actors involved. And it is important to note that the United States, pretty much from the beginning, was involved in that trajectory, because, Taiwan in 45 was, at the beginning of 45, was still a part of the Japanese Empire, right? Japan took it over in 1895, took it out of the hands of China, and kept it for, wait, was it? Yeah, it was 1895. Yeah, it kept it for these 50 years, and it was an integral part of the Japanese Empire, right? To the point where the University of Taipei was a former Japanese imperial university, the same way that Tokyo University or Kyoto University were imperial universities. Taipei University was so too. And there's this long occupation, basically Japanese occupation of Taiwan, that then ended because Japan lost the Second World War. Who did it lose to? It lost to the United States and, well, the Soviet Union, but only in the last 1 month. But it mainly lost to the United States in the Pacific, and then you've had years of upheaval. And in 1949, again, Chiang Kai-shek moved his troops and his entire administration to Taipei, and it was able then to maintain that position because the communists tried to, of course, further attack Chiang Kai-shek it managed to maintain that position because the United States intervened, because the United States already at that point sent carriers and supported Chiang Kai-shek and told the communists, stop it now. And they had to stop it, not just in the island of Taiwan. It was stopped right in front of the coast of Xiamen. You might have heard of these two islands, Kinmen and Matsu. Kinmen and Matsu are tiny little islands, 3 miles, 5 kilometers or so outside of the coast of Xiamen. And those are Taiwanese islands. I mean, these islands still today are under the control of the Republic of China, the name of the government of Taiwan, right? They call themselves Republic of China. And that's very important to know. Why? Because they are the Republic of China, right? It's Chiang Kai-shek's government that was evacuated. And Kinmen and Matsu, even today, are administered by the Republic of China. Although they are militarily indefensible. If China decided to actually take Taiwan, these would be the first two places that would be gone, just gone, because they're right across the strait. You can literally, from Kinmen, you can literally see the mainland, Xiamen. Kinmen receives its sweet water from Xiamen because, again, there's an agreement between them. And so, politically, currently, this setup is working. And to come back to this initial question, I still view that this trajectory, this historical trajectory, informs the current conflict very much. The big change that took place over the last 70 years is that the nature of what the conflict is about changed, in my view. And I'm not sure if Warwick would agree with that, but I'd be happy to discuss. Because to me, the core of the conflict at the beginning, in 1949, at the beginning, I mean, at that point, the Civil War was already raging for years, right? But once Chiang Kai-shek withdrew to Taiwan, for decades, the dude said, I'm going to retake it. I'm going to retake the mainland. I mean, we are the government of China. The question was, who is China? Is it the government in Taipei or is it the government in Beijing? Now, to me, that question has definitely been answered. Nobody anymore worldwide, or even among the two Chinas, disputes who is the official leader of the China, right? Just remember that until the 1970s, I think 72, 73, the Security Council seat of China in the UN was held by Taipei. It was Chiang Kai-shek's ambassador who was sitting on that seat. And then the General Assembly said, come on, I mean, we are kidding ourselves, right? We all know who the real China is. They kicked that one out, and in came the ambassador sent from Beijing, from the People's Republic of China, to occupy that seat. And then we've had, of course, Nixon and Kissinger coming along and pulling that big feat of actually recognizing the Beijing, the People's Republic, as the official China, with the understanding that Taiwan would be, I mean, the Republic of China would be left the way it is, and that there would be no invasion, at least at that point. And the Americans did that, of course, in order to wrestle China, the People's Republic, away from the Soviets, in order to deepen the rift between these two. And now, 40 years even after that, the question really is not anymore who's China. The question has morphed into, is Taiwan independent? Which is also what we talk about in the West, right? And a lot of our media is trying to make us believe that Taiwan as a country exists. But it must be repeated time and again that nobody recognizes Taiwan as an independent country, not even Taiwan. Taiwan's government calls itself the Republic of China, even though they try not to talk about it very much anymore. Even though in the new passports, the words Republic of China in English are gone from the passports. They remain in Chinese, but they took away the English acronym, ROC. They write now Taiwan on their passports. So the Taiwanese try to assert that they are a different thing, while the mainland Chinese assert that, no, you're not. And we actually have an agreement that there's only one China and Taiwan is part of it, because that was kind of the formula in order to square the circle before, in order to say that, okay, we have we have one China, Taiwan is part of it. We just disagree who's the ruler. Taipei thinks it's the ruler and Beijing thinks it's the ruler. We accept that, but we accept that it's one China. And the mainland today, the People's Republic, keeps saying like, that's the deal. And you have to accept it, and you have to agree that you are, you're part of us, right? And the Taiwanese keep saying like, no, we're not. We've never ever had a single PRC soldier on our land. Therefore, we're different. And that's the conflict. And even inside Taiwan, you have different opinions on what the way forward should look like. And paradoxically, it is today the Kuomintang, so the nationalist party, the success, the outcome. I mean, the same party that back in 1949 withdrew the entire Republic of China to Taiwan. It's that party, the party of Chiang Kai-shek, who today says like, we should reunify. We should really kind of accept that we're all Chinese and we go back to the mainland. And it is the opposition party, the DPP, and that says like, no. We have to work toward independence. Without officially saying so, without declaring it. So you see, like history sometimes pulls funny feats. That today it's the nationalists who agree that the Chineseness overweighs or outweighs the need for an own state, and they would rather, a lot of them would rather go back, whereas it is a new generation of politicians and who foster Taiwanese-ness as a path towards an own state.
You explained that better than anybody I've ever heard, by the way. Thank you for that background, Pascal. That was fascinating. I'm going to try to recap it as briefly as I can because I've got a bunch of questions that I want to pull on there. So, and I'm going to go back to 1895 when Japan took Taiwan from China because I think that's relevant, and they held it for 50 years until Japan was defeated in World War II and then essentially vanquished the island, at which point the civil war began in China between Chiang Kai-shek, who was the head of the Chinese government, and I guess the emerging Communist Party. I need some clarity on that part, so bookmark that, but I'm going to keep going here. 4 years, 5 years into that conflict, Chiang Kai-shek had to be evacuated from China to the island of Taiwan under the protection of the United States military. And that's where things kind of ended. This was the stalemate that was occurred. But until the 70s, the world still recognized Chiang Kai-shek's government located in Taiwan as the head of China. And it was, so 25, 30 years went by, right? And that was still how the world recognized China. That shifted for some reason in the 70s. I'd love some more clarity on that part too, but I don't want to get too hung up on it. Here we are today where most of us around the world understand China is President Xi, Taiwan is Taiwan. They're two separate things. As weird as that evolution of two countries is, as you said at the front end, it's also mutually beneficial to both parties. And doesn't strike me as any strong reasons why anybody would want to disrupt that. China is Taiwan's largest trading partner. It seems like business is good. I struggle to find a reason why somebody would want to disrupt that peace and good business, right? Yet, as I understand, President Xi has told his military he wants them to be ready for a successful takeover of Taiwan by 2027. He didn't say he's going to invade, if I understood that correctly. What he did say is he wants his military to be ready for a successful takeover of Taiwan by 2027. So there's that's one question I have for you right there on the end is how would you interpret that statement? Did I get the background relatively accurate based on what you shared? And then I want to go on to this next point. Why the tension if this is a mutually beneficial agreement, as awkward as the evolution has been?
The first thing I must say is I don't know whether that statement that is claimed that she made about 2027 is actually correct or not. It might be, it might not. I simply don't know. The matter of the fact is that the PRC mainland navy got much stronger, and that there definitely Taiwan is a red line, right? The Taiwan is hugely important to the PRC as a political talking point, as an issue. If somebody in Taipei, if the president, not the premier, the president stepped in front of the cameras tomorrow and declared in front of the cameras, we are hereby declaring the Republic of Taiwan. We are shedding the Republic of China. We are hereby declaring to be our own republic. That would be a casus belli for Beijing, and they would have to attack, because simply not doing so would delegitimize the Communist Party in the eyes of basically every Chinese on the mainland, right? So you are at a point again where, due to how you spoke about that plot of land in the past, you are now forced to do something. Otherwise, you look up utterly incredible, not just to the outside world, but to your own people. And states have a very poor track record of letting go of territories that they controlled or possessed or something. Look at all of the overseas territory of France. Look at how long it took for the decolonization process to actually happen. Look at how many territories the United States today possesses, and just try the United States to leave Guam, for instance. Hell, they will not do that, and they don't claim that this is an inherent part of their territory. And I have another example which is highly instructive. Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, today's the state of Mongolia, couldn't join the United Nations until the 1960s. I believe 65 or so was the day, 20 years after the year, 25 years after the UN was actually founded in 45. And they couldn't join because it was the one thing that the PRC and the ROC agreed on, which is that no, Mongolia is not an independent state. Mongolia belongs to me. Because the Republic of China, as it was founded 113 years ago on the mainland, included Outer Mongolia. It was China was even bigger. It included Taiwan and it included Mongolia. And then the Mongols managed to get their independence first de facto, and they wanted that de jure as well. And that was one of the last sticking points. And they couldn't join the UN because it was the Republic of China, which in the Security Council said, no, we are not letting them join because they belong to us, even though at that point the Republic of China was really only controlling Taiwan. But they said, once we get everything back, we're going to get back Mongolia too, because they're not independent. And it took until the 60s to actually for them to give that standpoint up and then let Mongolia join, because that was something the Russians wanted, the Soviets wanted. And Mao also then to basically resign. I think Mao the last time in the late 60s said Mongolia belongs to us, and then at some point he too accepted okay, fine, Mongolia is independent. Outer Mongolia, not Inner Mongolia. Inner Mongolia is still today part of China, of course. So there's a very poor track record of letting go. So I don't see how the mainland, Beijing, could let go of Taiwan. The one that has kind of let go of the idea of being the whole of China is Taiwan, but again they replaced that with a different kind of local ideology. And just also one more thing that is very instructive and important to keep in mind: the difference between Taiwan and Hong Kong is that Hong Kong already had a political settlement, an agreement of what would happen in the future, because the British, Margaret Thatcher, actually signed a piece of paper that said after 1997 there will be a 50-year period of a transition period in which Hong Kong has its own set of laws and the mainland has its own set of laws, and after 50 years that will go away and mainland China law will become the law of the land also in Hong Kong. Now, what happened in 2017 is that China sped that process up basically by creating a legal bridge of making the Hong Kong's independent law, penetrating it with a security act that they can demand the extradition of people that they don't like into the mainland, and which then basically undermines the entire sovereign idea of Hong Kongese law. But the point is the end date 2047 was already agreed on. We have no such agreement between Beijing and Taipei. There is no automatic endpoint to this. So these systems now run in parallel to each other, and the claims run parallel to each other. And that's why it's a big factor of insecurity at the moment. And I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely you did. Thank you very much for that. And so despite there not being a parallel agreement, Taiwan is inevitably a red line for China. They now have the military force to defend it if they needed to. And maybe just for the simple fact that loss aversion is very strong. We hate to lose things, territories included, right? Countries will fight to maintain territories and boundaries. So then let me ask you, why are so many Americans so hawkish on defending Taiwan? And this book behind me here, Elbridge Colby, was on my show maybe a month ago. This is the sole focus for him. He's like, we need to get out of Europe. We need to get into the South Pacific now. This is the number one priority for America. The book is called Strategy of Denial. And what he's talking about is the mindset that we're denying China is the biggest and most important threat to the United States and needs to be dealt with today. His strategy for dealing with that is increased military in the South Pacific, among many other things. Why is it such a focus for so many Americans if this is an obvious red line for the other major global power, and would obviously cause massive conflict if the United States got too involved in the future of Taiwan, if China wanted a certain outcome and the United States prevented that from occurring?
There's several reasons for that. And I believe there are several motivations. One, the most benign motivation for this viewpoint is that some people believe that deterrence is the backbone of security. You need to deter the other from changing the status quo. So you need to be threatening. You need to ramp up your armaments, including your navy, and point the guns at them and say, like, don't you dare, and stare them down and make sure that then keeps the peace, right? If both point their guns and nobody shoots, we've got peace. That's the benign version of some people's motivation. Then there's the not so benign one, which is people who believe that either war is inevitable or they want war, as in, it is in our interest to have a war with China and break that goddamn thing and make sure that we remain top dog. We're going to do with China what we did with the Soviet Union. Just put enough pressure and the thing's going to fall apart. It's a house of cards. So just blow strong enough and then it will fall apart, and then we're going to be the king of the hill, the way that it is supposed to be, because shining city, right? Everybody should be like us, and we are the example for the world. I mean, this is like some of the most outrageous neocon mindset, and they would they have an incentive to use this strategic opportunity, which is the internal conflict between Beijing and Taipei, in order to get that. I mean, if you want to fight a just war, and if you want your whole country behind you, and you want to fight with the whole force of what you have, what you need is a good narrative. So you need to be the shining knight that comes along and defends the poor little maiden that's about to be raped by the evil dragon. And you create that narrative. And this is Taiwan is in this sense a very convenient, weak maiden that can be rescued and saved. So that's the most hawkish of the warmongering bastards that I know about. And there's also something in between. I mean, there are people that I respect highly and who I think got most things right in their analysis, like John Mearsheimer, who out of his own theory of how international relations works, says that the conflict, the security competition between China and the US is inevitable. We're already in it, and that security competition is only going to get worse. Therefore, since every great power, once it becomes a great power, will try to make sure the other great powers go away or retreat, what the US needs to do in order to maintain its position among the great powers is to oppose China as strongly as it can, and China is the only peer competitor there is. So you need to point the guns and everything. But people like John Mearsheimer, of course, wouldn't want to go to war. They want to avoid the war, but they will still follow that kind of their own theory and say like, so what we need to do is the deterrence thing, right? Mm-hmm. But we mustn't go further in order to keep a stable environment. So there's several there's different types of analysis, and there's different types of prescription of what should happen, and there's different types of motivations for why you want to take a belligerent stand toward China. And unfortunately, it is not clear who's in charge, and the final policy that will be taken is inevitably going to be some form of mix of all of those. And the people who say like we should retreat from the Pacific and just care about our own hemisphere and so on are currently just not too few and far between to actually inform the decision making largely. This might change depending on what will happen tomorrow from our perspective, or what will have happened from the perspective of our viewers, whether Donald Trump wins or not, because he represents a different vision of U.S. foreign policy. And the long answer is it really very much depends, but you have these different motivations, and I'm pretty scared of them actually, because if something goes wrong, even with just the benign deterrence vision, you're going to end up in a huge war.
Okay. And for context, what Pascal is referring to is today is November 4th, and therefore tomorrow is November 5th, the election. And we're not publishing this till November 8th, I believe. So there's a world that can change in between now and then. That was a very ominous statement that you just finished with, that deterrence, even if benign, could be the linchpin that throws us into a major war. I hosted an event, it was like 18 months ago now, Pascal, and the whole theme of the event was, have we entered World War III? And that's where I met Aldrich Colby. Actually, we had him come and speak. And General Wesley Clark was my first guest of the day, and I asked him outright, I said, are we in World War III? And when I say we, I mean, North America, right? And he says, in the eyes of our adversaries, we're already long into World War III. We just haven't realized it yet in the West. When you hear a statement like that, do you think that's a bit hyperbolic and sensational? Do you put weight on it? Does that make sense to you? Why somebody like General Clark would say World War III has already begun? It's and if you ask, depending on who you ask, most are aware of it. But in the West, we're not quite clear on that yet. What's your take?
It's a very relevant question to international relations and history, but we can't answer it because the collective agreement on what we call a certain period is usually only made post facto. We will only be able to answer that question in about 20 years because a lot of these dates are pretty arbitrary, and a lot of the names that we give to these periods are arbitrary in the sense that, if you were a Spanish person in 1938 and you're already in the midst of a civil war, to you the world would already look like it is in a Second World War, right? Although officially it doesn't start officially in the sense that we conceptualize it today. It doesn't start until September 1st, 1939, and it lasts until. Again, if you ask the Europeans, they will tell you the Second World War ended in March 1945 when Berlin fell. And if you ask the Japanese, they will tell you it ended in September 1945 when we signed the Declaration of Surrender in 45. And then calling the end of the World War, okay, you had a lot of theaters that kind of wound down, but at the same time you had Korea coming up. You had then the Civil War in China that was still raging on. So, the naming of these periods is very much dependent on whose perspective you look at it from. So if this admiral that you were talking about, or General
Wesley Clark, yeah,
General Wesley Clark, I mean, he obviously thinks of it from the perspective of America, and he expects more warfare to come. And he's probably one of the people who would think that a war with China is inevitable, and therefore we are already in the preludes of that one, and we're fighting right now with Ukraine and the war in the Middle East, and this is going to expand. It's a very scary vision. I hope it doesn't come through, because there's always the opportunity and the chances of managing conflicts. And one element that gives me hope is that the people who are the worst at managing conflicts are the Europeans and North Americans. I mean, us. We are really, really crap at it. Whereas if you look at other regions of the globe, they do a good job at managing conflicts at different levels. Look at the Chinese and the Indians. They have open border disputes, like very intense ones, right, about border territories. But they manage it, for instance, by telling their soldiers, you're not allowed to use your weapons. You can throw stones and sticks, but you don't use weapons. And they literally do that. And then they still cooperate in BRICS.
Yeah.
Both of them are BRICS countries, right? Yeah. So they keep things apart, and they don't try to mesh everything together. That is a very typical Euro-American approach to international relations, of just saying, like, if I don't agree with you and you don't come over to my side, then you're my enemy and I will fight you on every different level I have. I mean, okay, nobody does that. I'm exaggerating, of course, but there are other regions of the world that are better at conflict management, and these regions are currently increasing in importance. Not because they become so adversarial, but just because they create now these alternative structures. We already talked about BRICS and so on. And the structural impact of us is diminishing, luckily. So that gives me hope that these alternative management systems, also the way that China and Taiwan are managing their conflict, might have a future and keep the conflict alive, but below the threshold of firing at each other. Conflicts need to be managed because they are inevitable, but what we need to do is to keep them under the threshold of killing each other. So create alternative ways and mechanisms. That's the whole idea of creating law, right? We have a law system in order to have conflicts inside societies that do not become family feuds where you have to kill each other, but where you can drag each other to court. You have alternative mechanisms. And we are far away from having a good international functioning dispute resolving mechanism. We have certain things, but I hope that the structural increase of importance of the global South will add to this ability and take away the all or nothing approach of the Euro-Americans.
And just for context, what Pascal's referencing with the China-India dispute is, right now there is an open territory dispute in the Himalayas between these two countries. Despite that, Prime Minister Modi was just in Kazan meeting with President Xi, gifted him some very valuable Indian art. They manage it differently than we do. And as you were explaining that, how us in North America and in Europe are so terrible at managing conflict, I found myself wondering, is this because we're too idealist? And is that because it's the affluent part of the world? And when you become affluent, maybe you become more idealist instead of being more realist. I mean, to steal some language from John Mersheimer, who you mentioned earlier, he kind of preaches realism, right? Here is how the world will function, right? Not what you want to occur, but what's probably going to occur, very, very much simplified. And I think if we're bad at it, maybe it's because we're more idealistic than realistic. And maybe that's because we've had it too good for too long relative to an emerging economy who hasn't. And maybe a harsher reality has led to a more realistic approach to conflict just from basic self-preservation. What do you think about that?
That can be a point. And I definitely think it has something to do with ideology. So maybe rather than idealism, it's more this idea that it's ideology in the sense that you frame the world in a certain way and everything has to fit into that framing. And if it doesn't, then you make it fit because you interpret it in a certain way. So instead of saying that, the Kashmir dispute between India and China is an ingenious way of conflict management, you just say like, oh, they're just hedging the bets. They're just both too weak. Therefore they are afraid of each other. Therefore they can, which is then a way of reframing something that's happening under our mental mindset, right? the other thing is like there's definitely also an element of arrogance, just absolute arrogance of like knowing better than everybody else, which probably has to do with the fact that Euro Americans, we whites, managed to subdue the rest of the world for 500 years. So 500 years is a long time for a certain mindset to take root. And this idea, even the way that we talk about international relations, right? That for the longest time we talked about developed nations and developing, with the idea that these states have to catch up. I mean, we talked for 500 years about everybody else not being on our level yet, already not only implying that they're less good and less valuable, less worth, but that they're also, the end point is to become us.
Right.
So, right. Okay, we look at everybody striving towards becoming us, and if you work differently than us, then it means that you're not there yet, either because you're dumb or evil or something, and this still continues despite the entire woke rhetoric, despite the whole anti-racism and so on. It still continues to this kind of mindset of thinking of the others as somebody who has to be you but isn't yet, therefore you need to help them, and if they don't want it, they are doing something wrong and you just need to do it harder.
Right.
And this is continuing, institutionally continuing, right? With the Bretton Woods institutions and the IMF and so on, and the idea of like, oh, if a country has debt, then what it needs is structural reform in order to be more like us. And then we install, some puppet regimes that then run the show the way we want them to run it, because that's the right way. And this is the neo-colonial mindset, which also the global South, and I'm very happy to have that word now because it's a very useful way of reframing. The global South just doesn't take that anymore. No, guys, no. And again, they don't do it in opposition. They're now saying like, do your thing, but we're going to do our thing, and we're going to do it differently. And if ever you want to join, you're welcome to join in the future, but just no anymore. And they have now that structural power, which is new. You wasn't there even during the Cold War. Yeah, you had the NUM movement. Yes, you had countries that said they're different, but they didn't have the structural power to enforce it. Now they do. It is just not possible at the moment for the Euro Americans to break up Russia the way the Soviet Union broke into pieces. They tried. They had those ideas in 2022 after the breakout. They were thinking about balkanizing Russia and having then 15 to 20 successor states. And there are people who argue that this is what should happen to China, and just keep the others fragile. And it's not working. So that there's a change now, and that's something that I believe that frightens a lot of people. And the Europeans already have become insignificant, and the Americans are afraid that might happen to them. So therefore, you got to double down, and that's what's now dangerous, and that's the most important thing to manage at the moment, in my view, is to reassure the United States that no, you will still be an important and beloved part of the future of international relations, even if you do not have troops in every single country of the earth.
Right. That's a profound. So I mean, yes, because and during that 500 year of, call it like, European Christian empire rule, there was always, maybe, again, in hindsight, everything's obvious. Back to your point about when civil wars begin and end, 20 years later, it's obvious to us. When you're in it, it's not at all. So again, I'm using hindsight bias here to say, oh, maybe it was obvious after the Portuguese would come the Spanish, then would come the Dutch, then would come the British, then obviously then would come the American. There's not a clear successor today in that European empire sequence. There isn't one. So who's next, right?
And the funny thing is, while these changes happen, we feel them. We have a sense for this, but we don't always have the words to describe them. I'll give you an example. We still talk about the post-Cold War period, right? And we talked for the longest time about the post-Cold War. And we all agreed the Cold War ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, or in 1989, actually. There's a discussion. And Jack Matlock, for instance, insists, no, the Cold War ended in 89 when we negotiated it to an end. And in 91, the Soviet Union broke apart. That was already after the Cold War. But then, since 2022, everybody understands that now something is different. And we connect, of course, the Russo-Ukrainian war to that. But we haven't invented a new word yet to describe the post-Cold War. we understand something is different now, and the post-Cold War would need to be rephrased, because of course we're still in the post-Cold War, but the system works now differently. And we are now we're working out little by little. Was that the unipolar moment? I probably will remember it as the unipolar moment, like 89 to 2022. But we haven't settled on a word yet. And we also haven't settled on a word for the new one. Maybe the multipolar moment, I don't know. But we haven't completely pinned it down. But we feel it, we understand it, and we talk about it, and we discuss it. But the jargon, the mental framing, and the agreement on how it should be thought about hasn't quite arrived yet.
But just to use the word moment, I think really does put it in perspective, the unipolar moment. Because when you live in the moment, it feels like the mean. It feels like the norm, right? This is the mean that we will always revert to. In reality, this has been a moment in history. Unipolar is not the mean. It's not the norm. Multipolar is much more frequently the norm. And especially, coming from, Canada is a super young country, America as well. We maybe make the mistake of thinking about history inside the context of our country's history. So if you're American, you might think about relevant history being 250 years. And if that's the case, then 500 years seems like infinity, right? Whereas if you grew up in mainland China and you're more familiar with 2,000 years of written history, then you're going to be much more likely to embrace the changing world order as an unavoidable outcome, because you've got a much bigger perspective on world order. Yeah?
Yeah, I believe so. Framing and also time framing matters very much. But that's something we can only change for ourselves, in the sense that we can try to be aware of it and try to remind ourselves that it's relevant how we think of the passage of time. Even that we start counting the years with the birth of Jesus Christ, right? 2,000 years basically cuts out the importance of the Mesopotamians. It cuts out the importance of the Egyptians, right? And these big empires that were there even before. It cuts out the Indians and again the Chinese as well. That's something that we as analysts should do. And also when we try to understand the other actors in international relations, that we try to put ourselves into their shoes, and that the world looks different from the perspective of a Chinese strategist should be clear. So in order to avoid stupid reasons to go to war because you misunderstand each other, we definitely need to comprehend each other's viewpoints, which also goes for the Chinese, who must understand that the Americans and the Canadians just have a different perception on time and on strategic importance and of themselves in the world.
Look, Pascal, this has been a fascinating conversation. Super fun, actually. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So I think there's a part 2 here. I'm gonna leave it to let us know in the comments. Do you want Pascal back? I want him back for sure. This is a thrill. Thanks so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Jay, for the opportunity, and all the best.
Yeah, and before you go, I want to point people to where they can find more of you. You've got a few things going on. So where should we point people today who want to hear more from you?
I have my own YouTube show called Neutrality Studies. You can follow me there, or a Substack also called Neutrality Studies, and there I publish updates regularly. I have Twitter X, but I suck at that one. I'm just not good at this short form thing.
Yeah.
But so I think Substack is good if you just want to read occasionally. I'm trying not to spam people's mailboxes.
And what's the focus of Neutrality Studies, Pascal?
So my main, this goes together with my academic study, right? I study third-party actors in international relations, and I call that neutral actors, which means countries, but also institutions like the International Red Cross or the Bank for International Settlement, or even just tribes among each other, that end up in conflict. And I'm currently trying to build, together with a group of others, a conceptual framework around that, because it's an alternative way at trying to manage international relations with, the more states that stay out of wars, the more peace spreads, not necessarily by imposing it from above, but by refusing to engage in it. And this is a very old strategy. I can trace it back 2,400 years to Greece and India. A guy called Kautilya who already wrote about that. Very old. And under the current framework, we don't take into consideration third-party actors. When we talk about wars, we talk about those who fight: Ukraine, Russia, NATO. But we completely leave out the other actors who try to influence the conflict in various ways. Let's take the United Nations, or take neutral countries, even like Turkey, that managed to be neutral in this conflict and mediate. And I'm working on more research on these states, and that's what neutrality studies refers to. And then I do on YouTube, I have a geopolitics channel that I call that, and then I discuss various instances, not only of neutrality but also of world conflict.
Okay. Yes. Thanks so much, Pascal. I'll have links to your content beneath this show. Once again, appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Jay.